Okay, so in the previous video we introduced ourselves to Cramer's rule, where we had d sub x, and d sub y, and where x was equal to d sub x divided by d, y was equal to d sub y divided by d. Now, if you notice, now I have three equations, so a system of three equations with three unknowns. So what we're going to do is we're going to find d sub x, and d sub y, as well as d sub z. So z, following the pattern, is going to be d sub z divided by d. So if you notice, we have to find four different determinants for this problem. So let's look at wherever I have d. Remember, d is just your x, y, and z values. So I have a 5, a 3, a -3, 3, -4, 1, 1, 7, 1. And then remember, with a 3 by 3, what I'm going to do is I'm going to recopy these first two columns. So 5, 3, 3, -4, 1, 7. This way I can find my values a little bit easier. So now then d is going to be equal to 5 times -4 times 1 plus 3 times 1 times 1 plus a -3 times 3 times 7. -3 times 3 times 7. Remember, these were my first three forward diagonals. Now I go to my backward diagonals where they start with a minus sign. 1 times -4 times -3, right here. Then I'm going to have 7 times 1 times 5. It's still going to be a minus. Times 1 times 5 minus 1 times 3 times 3. 1 times 3 times 3. So d is equal to 5 times -4, which is -20, times 1. It's going to give me a -20. Plus 3 times 1 times 1 is 3. Plus -3 times 3 is -9. Times 7 is going to give me a -63. Minus 1 times -4 is -4. -4 times -3 gives me a +12. Minus 7 times 1 is 7. 7 times 5 is 35. Minus 1 times 3 is 3. Times 3 is 9. And then at this point, I'm just going to put these in my calculator as I see them. So -20 plus 3 plus a -63 minus 12 minus 35 minus 9, which should give me a -136. This is my d. So this is going to be my denominator all the way across here. Now we need to look at d sub x. Remember, with d sub x, my y and my z column will stay the same. My x column actually becomes these results, okay? So those results are going to become my x column, so -14, 2, and 6. Then my other two columns are going to stay the 3, -3, -4, 1, 7, and 1. And then I'm going to copy over my first two columns, -14, 2, 6, 3, -4, 7. Notice I copied over these two columns, not the original columns. Now I'm going to find my determinant of this. So d sub x is going to equal to a -14 times a -4 times 1. So -14 times a -4 times 1 plus 3 times 1 times 6 So 1 times 6 plus a negative 3 times 2 times 7. So negative 3 times 2 times 7. I'm done with my first 3 forward diagonals. Now I'm going to go to my backward diagonals, which indicates a minus. 6 times negative 4 times negative 3. So 6 times negative 4 times a negative 3 minus 7 times 1 times a negative 14. 7 times 1 times a negative 14 minus 1 times 2 times 3 times 2 times 3. So d sub x, negative 14 times a negative 4 is a positive 56 times 1, so that's positive 56. Plus 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 6 is 18. Plus negative 3 times 2 is a negative 6. Negative 6 times 7 gives me a negative 42. Minus 6 times negative 4 is a negative 24. Negative 24 times a negative 3 is going to give me a positive 72. Minus 7 times 1 is 7. 7 times negative 14 is going to give me a negative 98. Minus 1 times 2 is 2. 2 times 3 is 6. So d sub x, 56 plus 18 plus a negative 42 minus 72 plus 98 minus 6 results in 52. So I found my d sub x. Now I need to find my d sub y. So with d sub y, my first column is going to go back to my 5, 3, 1. My second column, which is my y's, is going to change to this negative 14, 2, and 6. My third column, which is my z's, is going to stay negative 3, 1, 1. Then I'm going to write down my first 2 columns again. So it's going to be a 5, 3, 1, negative 14, 2, and 6. And I'm going to find my determinant. D sub y is equal to 5 times 2 times 1. So 5 times 2 times 1 plus negative 14 times 1 times 1. So negative 14 times 1 times 1 plus negative 3 times 3 times 6. So times 3 times 6. I've done my top diagonals, so now I'm going to start with my bottom diagonals, which is going to be minus 1 times 2 times negative 3. So 1 times 2 times a negative 3 minus 6 times 1 times 5. So 6 times 1 times 5 minus 1 times 3 times negative 14. 1 times 3 times a negative 14. So d sub y is equal to 5 times 2, which is 10, times 1 is 10, plus negative 14 times 1 is negative 14, times another 1 is a negative 14. Negative 3 times 9 is negative 3, or I'm sorry, negative 9. Negative 9 times 6 is going to be a negative 54. Minus 1 times 2 is 2, times a negative 3 is a negative 6, minus 6 times 1 is 6, 6 times 5 is 30, minus 1 times 3 is 3, 3 times a negative 14 is going to be a negative 42. Watch your signs because these become positive here. D sub y is going to become a negative 40. Okay, I found these 3. Now I've got to find d sub z. So whenever I come down, and I'm going to have d sub z is equal to, my first column goes back to 5, 3, 1. My y column goes back to 3, -4, 7, because that's the coefficients that y were. Now my z column is going to become the -14, 2, and 6. And I'm going to copy down those first two columns again. 5, 3, 1, 3, -4, 7. So that I can find d sub z. Okay, so d sub z is going to be 5 times a -4 times a 6, right here, plus 3 times 2 times 1, so 3 times 2 times 1, plus a -14 times 3 times 7. So I've got these forward diagonals. Now I'm going to the backward diagonals. So -1 times -4 times a -14 minus a 7 times 2 times 5 minus a 6 times 3 times 3. So d sub z is equal to 5 times -4 is -20. -20 times 6 is a -120. Plus 3 times 2 is 6 times 1 is 6. Plus -14 times 3 is -42 times a 7 gives me a -294. Minus 1 times -4 is -4. -4 times a -14 is going to give me a +56. Minus 7 times 2 is 14. 14 times 5 is 70. Minus 6 times 3 is 18. 18 times 3 is 54. So I'm going to add all of those up, and I get a -588. So all I've done so far is actually found my determinants that I need to plug in up here. So I have x, y, and z. The d that we first found goes on the denominator of all three of them, so -136. Then my numerator for x is my d sub x. Remember, it was 52. My d sub y was a -40. And my z, my d sub z, was a -588. I'm going to simplify these and leave them as fractions because they don't come out to nice pretty decimals, and I don't want to do any rounding here. So x is going to become a -13/34. Y is going to become a +5/17. Z is going to become +147/34. So what this means is down here, whenever I have three variables, it's going to be x, y, z. Okay? So in our case, it is a -13/34, 5/17, 147/34. Not 36, 34. So let me make sure that I put 34 there. This is my solution. If you have three variables and three unknowns, it is definitely going to take you much longer to work with because you have to find that additional determinant plus you're working with 3 by 3s. So practice a few of these and then let me know if you have questions.